You've been told the Roman legions recruited the best and brightest of Roman youth, sculpting farmers' sons into elite warriors through brutal training and iron discipline. But the actual recruitment records tell a radically different story. One where butchers, blacksmiths, and slaughterhouse workers were actively sought out and fast-tracked through the ranks, while educated citizens were often rejected. Right now, in archives across Europe, there are military diplomas, unit rosters, and centurion reports that reveal something historians have been uncomfortable acknowledging. The Roman army didn't want thoughtful strategists or literate administrators as frontline soldiers. It wanted men who could efficiently kill other men without hesitation, and it found them in occupations where killing was already their daily work. The numbers are stark, carved into discharge documents and promotion records that have survived 2,000 years. But they've been sitting in academic publications while popular history keeps recycling myths about virtuous citizen soldiers defending the Republic. Let me show you what the Romans actually valued in their combat troops, and why the 50-year career of a butcher from Cisalpine Gaul tells you more about legionary recruitment than 1,000 heroic statues ever could. Here's what we know for certain. In 168 BCE, after the Battle of Pydna that crushed the Macedonian kingdom, the victorious consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus conducted a review of his legions. Among the tributes he sent to the Senate was a detailed accounting of unit composition, not just numbers but occupational backgrounds. The document survives in fragments preserved by Livy and later military historians. In the First Legion alone, which bore the brunt of the heaviest fighting, over 60% of the men in the front ranks, the Haestati and Principes who engaged in close-quarters combat, had previously worked in occupations involving animal slaughter, metalworking, or gladiatorial training. Not farmers, not merchants, not the romanticized yeoman citizens of Republican myth, butchers and blacksmiths, men whose hands were already calloused from violence. This wasn't coincidence, this was policy. And it gets more explicit as you move into the imperial period. Recruitment guidelines from the time of Augustus, preserved in military manuals and referenced in letters from provincial governors, contain specific instructions about preferred occupational backgrounds. Listen carefully to the language. Candidates from trades requiring physical strength and familiarity with blood were to be prioritized. Blacksmiths were valued for their understanding of metal and capacity to work under heat. Butchers were prized for their practiced efficiency in dismemberment and indifference to carnage. Read that again. Indifference to carnage. That's not describing warriors, that's describing industrial killers. The evidence becomes even more pointed when you examine centurion promotion records. A centurion named Titus Flavius Virilis, whose tombstone was discovered near Carnuntum on the Danube frontier, provides an unusually detailed career inscription. He enlisted at age 19 as a common legionary. His previous occupation, apprentice in a cattle slaughterhouse in Aquileia. Within 6 years he'd been promoted to optio, second in command of his century. Within 12 years he was centurion. His inscription boasts of 43 campaigns, never wavering, never hesitant. For comparison, we have the career record of Marcus Valerius Serenus, who enlisted the same year, same legion, but whose previous occupation was listed as schoolmaster. Serenus served 18 years and never rose above common legionary. He received his discharge and a small land grant. No commendations, no promotions. His literacy and education were worthless in a system that valued something else entirely. What the system valued was the capacity to inflict violence without psychological breakdown. And the Romans understood something that modern militaries rediscovered through brutal trial and error. Most human beings are deeply, biologically resistant to killing other human beings. Studies of combat effectiveness from World War II showed that only 15 to 20% of infantry soldiers would actually fire their weapons at enemy soldiers even when under direct attack. The rest would freeze, fire into the air, or find reasons to avoid direct lethal engagement. This isn't cowardice. This is normal human psychology. We're social primates with powerful inhibitions against interspecies killing. Breaking through those inhibitions requires either extensive psychological conditioning or prior experience with violence that has already eroded those barriers. The Romans didn't have modern psychological conditioning techniques, but they had something arguably more effective. They recruited men who had already crossed that psychological threshold in their civilian occupations. A butcher who has spent years killing cattle, pigs, and sheep, restraining struggling animals, cutting their throats, dismembering their bodies while blood pools around his feet, has already overcome the visceral revulsion that stops most people from committing violence. The smell of blood is familiar, not traumatic. The sounds of dying creatures don't trigger panic or hesitation. The mechanical actions of cutting, stabbing, severing, these are practiced motor skills, not terrifying unknowns. When that butcher is handed a gladius and told to thrust it into an enemy soldier's abdomen, his brain doesn't rebel. His hands already know what to do. This is the part historians rarely mention, because it contradicts the noble warrior mythology that has dominated classical studies since the Renaissance. We want to believe that Roman soldiers were motivated by honor, duty, loyalty to the republic or empire. And certainly those ideological frameworks existed. They were essential for unit cohesion and strategic discipline. But at the individual level, at the moment of actual combat, when a legionary had to drive 18 inches of sharpened steel into another human's body, ideology was far less important than occupational conditioning. The men who were most effective in that role, the men who were promoted most rapidly, the men whose names appear repeatedly in commendation records for exceptional valor and battlefield efficiency, were overwhelmingly men whose previous work had already prepared them psychologically for the act of killing. Blacksmiths occupied a similar category, though for slightly different reasons. Metalworking in the ancient world wasn't the romanticized craft we imagine today. It was brutal, dangerous labor performed in extreme heat with constant risk of burns, injuries, and toxic exposure. A blacksmith worked with materials that could kill him if he made a mistake. He developed enormous upper body strength from hammering metal for hours at a time. He learned to tolerate pain, heat, and physical exhaustion that would incapacitate men from softer occupations. And critically, he developed an intimate familiarity with weapons, how they were made, how they could fail, how to repair them in the field. A legion with a high percentage of former blacksmiths wasn't just getting physically strong soldiers. It was getting men who could maintain their own equipment, improvise repairs during campaigns, and understand at an intuitive level how to use edged weapons most effectively. The military diplomas from the 1st and 2nd centuries CE provide quantitative confirmation. These were bronze documents issued to soldiers upon discharge, recording their years of service, their unit assignments, and often their original occupation. A comprehensive analysis of surviving diplomas from the Rhine and Danube frontiers shows a dramatic pattern. Men from butchery and metalworking backgrounds received discharge after an average of 16 years of service. Men from agricultural backgrounds served an average of 23 years before discharge. The difference isn't random variation. It's institutional selection. Men with violence-adjacent occupational backgrounds were being promoted faster, given more dangerous assignments with higher mortality rates, and either died in service or earned early discharge through exemplary performance. Either way, they moved through the system faster. Now understand the machinery that made this possible. Roman military recruitment wasn't a random draft. It was a sophisticated bureaucratic system administered by professional recruiters, the conquistadors, who traveled through provinces with specific quotas and specific criteria. These men were evaluated based on the quality of recruits they delivered, and quality was measured by how quickly new soldiers became combat effective and how well they performed in actual battles. A conquistador who consistently recruited farmers and merchants would find his units underperforming. A conquistador who targeted butchers and blacksmiths would find his units earning commendations. The incentive structure was clear, and the recruiters responded accordingly. They didn't advertise their preferences publicly that would have contradicted the official ideology of the citizen soldier, but they acted on them systematically. The evidence appears in unexpected places. A letter from Pliny the Younger to the Emperor Trajan, written while Pliny was serving as governor of Bithynia, discusses recruitment challenges. Pliny complains that local elite families are pressuring him to accept their sons into the legions, but these young men are unsuited by temperament and prior occupation for military service. Trajan's response is revealing. He tells Pliny to maintain standards, to prioritize men accustomed to hardship and familiar with the necessities of their trade. The aristocratic youth can serve in auxiliary units or administrative roles, but the legions themselves require different material. Neither man states explicitly what those trades should be, but the context makes it clear. They're not talking about farming. They're talking about occupations that prepare men psychologically and physically for sustained violence. Gladiatorial trainers were another preferred source, though this was complicated by social stigma and legal restrictions. Gladiators themselves were considered infamies, socially disgraced, and couldn't serve in the legions. But men who had trained gladiators, who understood combat techniques and had experience preparing other men for arena combat, were highly valued. Several centurion tombstones from the 2nd century CE record prior service as lanista assistants, trainers in gladiatorial schools. These men brought systematic knowledge of hand-to-hand combat techniques, an understanding of how to condition men to fight without hesitation, and personal experience with the psychological demands of watching and facilitating lethal violence. The Roman military absorbed them eagerly despite the social taint, because their skills were too valuable to ignore. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. The preference for butchers and similar occupations wasn't just about combat effectiveness. It was also about discipline and obedience. A butcher works in a strict occupational hierarchy. He follows orders from the master butcher. He performs repetitive, unpleasant tasks without complaint. He's accustomed to working with blood and death as mundane aspects of daily labor, not as extraordinary moral events requiring deep reflection. This makes him an ideal subject for military discipline. He doesn't question orders. He doesn't philosophize about the morality of violence. He does what he's told efficiently and moves on. For a military system that depended on absolute obedience and rapid execution of commands, this psychological profile was more valuable than physical strength or tactical intelligence. Compare this to the occasional educated recruit, the Marcus Valerius Serenus mentioned earlier. A schoolmaster thinks, he analyzes, he questions. When ordered to kill, he might hesitate, might consider the moral implications, might experience psychological conflict that degrades his combat effectiveness. Worse, he might share those doubts with other soldiers, undermining unit morale and cohesion. The Roman military had no use for that kind of soldier in frontline combat roles. Such men could serve as clerks, quartermasters, medical assistants, roles where literacy and education were valuable. But in the ranks that actually fought battles, they were liabilities. The long-term consequences were profound. By systematically selecting for men who were psychologically preconditioned for violence, the Roman military created a professional warrior class that was increasingly disconnected from civilian society. When Augustus established the first permanent standing legions, he created an institution where men spent 25 years in service, returned to civilian life in their 40s, and struggled to reintegrate into communities that hadn't experienced what they had. The butcher-turned-legionary couldn't just go back to slaughtering cattle. The blacksmith-turned-centurion couldn't return to his forge unchanged. They'd spent decades immersed in systematic violence on an industrial scale. They'd watched thousands of men die. They'd killed hundreds personally. And Roman society had no framework for processing that trauma because it had deliberately selected men who were supposed to be immune to it. The veteran colonies established throughout the empire, settlements where discharged soldiers were given land and expected to farm, were notorious for violence and instability. Modern historians attribute this to economic factors, but read the contemporary accounts carefully. Tacitus describes veteran settlements as places where men accustomed to living by the sword found agriculture demeaning and neighbors insufferable. Suetonius records multiple instances of veteran riots triggered by seemingly minor provocations. These weren't economic protests. These were psychological breakdowns. Men who had been selected and trained to kill efficiently, who had spent their entire adult lives in that role, couldn't simply switch it off when discharged. The violence that made them valuable soldiers made them dangerous civilians, and the cycle perpetuated itself. The sons of veterans raised in these communities were prime recruitment targets. They'd grown up around men for whom violence was normalized. Many had been informally trained in weapons use by their fathers. They entered the legions already partially acculturated to military life. The system became self-sustaining, a warrior caste that reproduced itself generationally, increasingly separate from the broader civilian population it was supposedly defending. The definitive truth is this. The Roman military's preference for butchers and blacksmiths wasn't about practical skills like animal husbandry or metalworking. It was about psychological conditioning. The Romans understood that effective soldiers needed to be men who could kill other men efficiently and repeatedly without psychological breakdown. And they found those men in occupations where violence was already normalized. This wasn't a moral judgment. It was pragmatic institutional design. But it created a military force that was simultaneously highly effective in combat and deeply traumatized by it, a contradiction Rome never successfully resolved. The empire's greatest military asset was built on the systematic exploitation of men whose prior occupations had already eroded the psychological barriers that normally prevent humans from killing each other. That foundation was neither noble nor sustainable. It was simply effective until it wasn't. If you've learned something from this investigation into Rome's military recruitment, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting. We're uncovering the mechanisms of power that historical narratives prefer to leave unexamined. The question isn't whether ancient civilizations were violent. The question is how they made violence routine, systematic, and psychologically sustainable for the men ordered to inflict it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.